This is Ritual 11, and we're continuing to bring together resonances into a set. The reason why we take 4 presentations to make a set is that this quality allows for a subtle accumulation of layers. If one just takes the static object, there are several different levels of deception that come into play. And because of the structure of the mind, it doesn't notice the deception at all. This is why there can be something called sleight of hand. This is why there can be legerdemain, parlor magic, magicians. Because the hand, in a very practiced ritual way, can move in such a way that the mind does not pick up all of the movement and is so deceived. In ritual, if you miss a movement, you ruin the ritual. This is a very, very, very difficult thing to understand. But the upshot of it is that you cannot learn on the basis of mental ideas projecting themselves as authority. It cannot be done. It is not only impossible in terms of our capacity, it is impossible in terms of the universe. Existentiality that misses one iota out of a ritual comportment, out of an existential structure, falls apart or is different or is changed. If you take one electron away from an atom of an element, you ionize the whole atom. Now, there are ways in which the mind can be educated, learned, so that it does not miss. But it has to have the ritual basis before it has the symbol basis. And it has to have an experience, a mythic level of experience that is generated out of the ritual level, and not to have the mythic experience go back and dominate the ritual level. And the reason why it would tend to want to dominate the ritual level is that culture on that scale is impressed with its own feeling of power and authority, its ability to have an order, and it wants to make sure that the rituals are in conformance with the social order, because the rituals need to maintain the authority and the control. Whereas rituals that come out of nature emerge out of nature, and because they're emergent out of nature, they have the natural flow, and that natural flow is a flow of changes. Nature is like a mysterious ocean of changes, and in those changes, what occurs first is time. Whereas in a social order, it's not time that is the base, but it's temporality. And because the temporality is put into a culture mode, the temporality becomes tradition. Nature has no tradition. But nature does have themes that emerge in cycles, and the most apparent cycle on most planets, or even most moons, is the seasonal cycle. Now, on this particular planet, we have 4 seasons. In most of the temperate latitudes where cultures really developed and civilizations developed, so that you have the themes of seasonal cycles in nature, so that the rituals then follow the natural year, so that one has something called the ritual year. So that one has spring rituals and autumn rituals. One has summer rituals and one has winter rituals. And so that quality of emergent themes make for the ritual comportment, the ritual objectivity, the ritual actions, to come together as steps within a sequence that is renewable. It's always renewable. And a natural, existential-based ritual will always have the sense that we are renewing this particular phase now. We're doing these steps right now, and if we didn't do them, they would not occur and they would be missing. And existence would be fractured. So that we then do natural, thematic rituals to renew at every step of the way, as it were, so that the ceremonial comportment is one of renewing, whereas in culture of authority, of social orders, it's not to renew. Rituals are to maintain the order. It's a completely different thing. It's a totally different thing. And once one gets the objective, clear sight, the perception exactly of the difference, you never again will miss it. You'll be able to pick it up in any kind of detail or any kind of complexity. It is something to learn, to do, and it's like being able to tell a card sharp, and therefore a game that you're going to lose, from a play with cards where it really is just the play, and chances are natural. In really powerful social orders, like civilizations, especially civilizations that have failed and therefore are tremendously retrogressive. They're regressing massively. It's like a flood coming into the culture. A flood of despair, a flood of panic over losing power. And all of it comes in to infuse in an inflated way the natural tendency of a tradition in a social order to have its culture retrospectively refashion the rituals. So that while cultures retrospectively influencing rituals, like a court authority in medieval Japan, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. That court authority, when it is first formed, has a kind of almost harmless sense of checking and retrospectively trying to control the rituals. And those early courts even have a little bit of charm to them. But they are succeeded by much more successful, much stronger courts. A social order which in medieval Japan, when it first was there, it was certain clans would run the courts. The Fujiwara clan, out of which Lady Murasaki was married into. And Basho's favorite poet, Saigyo, from the 1100s, was born into a minor branch of the Fujiwara clan. As long as the clan basis controlled the social order, the clans were a ritual comportment in the first place, and so you had a natural base. But as soon as the Fujiwara clan was replaced by military dictatorships called the shoguns, then the shogun's court orders, the culture of the shogunate in Japan, made sure that the rituals were done exactly the way that they needed to be. And when you get a successor to the shogunate in Japan, you get the imperial Japanese empire, who say not only will all Japanese do these rituals our way, but all peoples that we conquer will do our rituals our way. So that you get different levels of complexity that are not understandable. They are not at all structurally clear if you take a political or an economic or a political economy view. They're not available for clarity. So one has to step aside from that kind of mentalized, assumptive, deceptive-prone learning education and go into something like what we are doing now. It's the only way to do it. So it's very powerful, enormously powerful. And once it starts to be apparent to you, your own exercise of using this learning, will improve itself indefinitely. Our pair includes not only Basho, but Euripides. And just like Basho, born in the 1600s in Japan, was born at a time when the shogunate was really very, very, very powerful, and had made sure that all traces of old Japan were limited to just a few examples and cut off as like special religious examples or as national park places, and that everything else was brought up to their speed. So that in the 1600s, the big shogunate show of power as a place was Katsura, the royal palace, just outside of Kyoto, built between 1620 and 1647, and Basho born in 1644, right into the time when the royal palace at Katsura had this enormous power and had the order of a shogunate Japan raised almost to the imperial level. Not quite yet, but almost there. Whereas the earlier form of Japanese social order places was at Ise, and Ise was a shrine down on the coast, the south coast of Japan, and where Basho was born in Ueno is in between Ise and the original capital of Japan, Nara. Nara goes back to the 600s. Ise goes back to the 600s. I believe it was begun in 685 AD. So Basho goes back to the Nara Issa Japan of 1,000 years before him. He goes back to that. It would be like someone in the 20th century going back to the time of Milarepa, around 1000 AD. Or somebody in our time going back to the millennia of 1000 AD, back to the time of Saint Anselm. So that Basho goes back a full 1,000 years and skips back over all of the social, ordered, tradition, authority in the culture, because Issa is not based, its rituals are not based on culture, its rituals are emergent from nature. So that while Katsura was built to be an authoritarian palace, big, impressive, and staying because it's going to be maintained, Issa is not maintained, it's renewed. It's rebuilt every so often, but every generation or so. So it's built to go through its seasonal cycle of being fresh and new, of being venerable and used, and then of being old and ready to be torn down and then renewed, rebuilt. So that the Issa shrine is like a ritual comportment which Basho has. Very, very, very noticeable. And when you have the approach to Issa, you have this torii gate. And the torii gate here is often said to be Shinto, but it's not Shinto. It is Buddhist of a very sophisticated quality, and the original gates that looked like this are in central India. And in central India, the gates that look like this are 4 gates for the 4 directions, for the 4 seasons of cycle of wholeness, and they are the approach to the great shrine put there, the great stupa built by Ashoka in 250 BC called Sanchi. And Ashoka built Sanchi to be a stupa, which is like a bell-shaped building. It is a building that is like a dome that has for its cupola a series of ritual forms which act like energy condensers. And the energy of the universe comes and is condensed in a ritual way, in a ritual sequence, so that it comes in like a lightning rod would collect lightning and is played out through geometric forms to then have its final form in the ringing of the building, the resonance of the stupa, and that when it rings, when its resonance rings, it isn't because the building moves, but that the resonance happens and what is in the building collects that resonance of the universe in a certain way and sends it back out selflessly, because what's in the stupa, what's there at Sanchi, is one of the relics of the historical Buddha. Now there are several places that were built like this in Sri Lanka, in Ceylon, at a place where they built, at Kandy, they built what's called the Temple of the Tooth. One of the Buddha's tooths was taken by his son Rahula to ancient Ceylon, and they built the Temple of the Tooth there in Ceylon. But Sanchi was built by Ashoka after his armies had conquered India in an Alexander the Great sort of way. His grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Maurya dynasty, had fought against Alexander the Great and then took his techniques to take over most of India. And Ashoka expanded it, and then he became embarrassed at what he had done, that he had set up an empire, like the Greeks, that was an imposition of the culture onto the actions of existence and human rituals, and instead of having those rituals emerge out of the mysteriousness of nature. And so he repented in a big way. He disbanded his armies. He built roads all across India. He planted food trees, fruit trees, nut trees, medicinal herbs along all the great roads. And at all the entrances to ancient India, called Bharat at that time, he posted pillars that gave the simple comportments. They are called the edicts of Ashoka. They're not rules of culture. They're ways in which the themes of universal nature play out through the rituals of objective comportment that are emergent from those universal mysterious natures, and then play themselves out in the way in which the social order is not a social order of tradition, but of expansion of natural themes through the ritual comportment of openness to let them pass through, so that the mythic level of feeling and languages and images is a continued flow of nature. They're parallel not above one another, but they're parallel in the sense that the culture now is a continuance of nature. And that the ritual level of objectivity is an open frame that allows the resonance of nature to continue and continue to resonate in the culture, so that the culture is natural and maintained so because the ritual frame is objectively open to the mystery of the changing powers of nature and allows them to come through, so that the ritual frame is like a membrane and allows for nature to flow through it into the culture. Basho was a champion of this. He is one of the greatest figures of all time in championing this. But in his time, it was not possible to do much vis-a-vis the power of the shogunate that had come to rule the culture, the social culture of Japan. And so you have a kind of polarity that's very easy for us to understand. When rituals are emergent from nature, they have themes. When they are imposed in a retrospection from the culture, then they do not have themes, but they have tradition. And that tradition, because it's not a form, it's a process, the form of that process, when put into a stricter sequence, is what Aristotle in the Poetics called mythos, plot. A social order tradition of a culture has for its molecular structure of sequence a plot, a mythos. And Aristotle is very clear about it, as peoples in every situation like this on the planet are always clear, because what is required at this time, because it is not natural. It is cultural and imposed, always. It has to be imposed on a basis of clarity. And so the mythos, in the form of a plot, pretends to be a precise structure. And it is this pretense that is fundamentally deceptive. because experience is never objective. It is always a process. What is objective is the ritual actions, the objective comportment, the existentials. They are the forms. And so the pretense of feeling toned experience, imaged and languaged, to be a form means that it has imposed its tradition onto the rituals and then inhabits those ritual objectivities as its body and assumes that they are well matched. And unless you have something like this phased education, there is no way to know that that is not true, and that it is further never true, is never the case. It is a startling thing indeed to wake up to the fact that existentials are only reconditioned by experience. They are not originated from experience. There's a very, very severe difference. And the waking up of that is one of the qualities of enlightenment. To be awake to that. Because one awakens out of natural awareness into cultural awakenness. And it's out of that cultural awakenness that one has for the first time to have an objective mind that is very clear, whose ideas are well ordered. They're not just ordered in some kind of authority, but they are well ordered in that they are integrally real, and they bring the whole ecology of nature and ritual and myth and symbol together in a cycle which is renewable. So that natural rituals are always renewable, whereas cultural rituals are always insisting to be maintained, maintainable. And that one goes through the rituals to make sure that the maintenance is in accordance with laws, in accordance with codes. And it is the pretense that laws and codes are structures of experience that is part of the deception. They are ritual structures, ritual objectivities that are initially already imposed by the cultural ethos, by the plot, by the myths. And so the mythology comes to take its place then as some authoritative cycle, and you get a false learning. I'm sorry to say, like a Joseph Campbell, where your basis should be to be absorbed by the mythology and follow your pleasure. Get your energy and get your juices going and get your person emerging out of the mythology. What emerges out of the mythology is always a retrospective ritual comportment, not a person. Because on the ritual level, in ritual phases, there are no persons. What is objectively actually there on the ritual level are figures. Figures. So that in ritual you have figures. In myth you have character. In symbols you have individuals. But only with consciousness, for the first time, is there a dimensional basis, a 5-dimensional basis, conscious time space, that is able to emerge the person. And the person is always an art form, never a ritual form. So that what is antithetical to the artist is to be reduced down to some kind of ritual figure. Because it is not only a retrospection being enforced, but a massive symbolic regression that is being inflated in its enforcement. You're being forced on one level, the retrospective power of the culture to do it, but on the symbolic level, the enforcement is not because of power so much, not because of authority, but because of terror. And so what happens to human beings is that while they are forced by authority on the mythic level, they are subject to terrorizing imperiums on the symbol level, all from the same fractured key, which we're looking at today. If you're a victim of that, the ancient Greek way in Greek tragedy was to have a tragic denouement, realizing too late that you were a victim, that you were a circumstance. You fell into this tragedy not because nature is tragic. Nature is not tragic at all. Nature is mysterious. What is tragic is the imposition of a social culture authority on what you do, and what you do gets misled without you even realizing that you're being misled until you wake up to the fact that it's all over. You failed not because you failed to carry out the authority, but that the whole authority was flawed. And that you accepted it out of pride. Oedipus is tragic not because he married his mother, but because he was told, you are going to eventually marry your mother, kill your father. You're going to get into that. And he assumed that he was able to sidestep that. The quality in the ancient classic Greek civilization that carried this was what is translated as destiny. Moira. In the classical Greek mystery religion, even the gods, even Zeus, all the Olympians are subject to destiny. There isn't anything they can do about it either. It is the destiny of Zeus's father to be killed by him and for Zeus to take his place. It is the destiny of Zeus to be killed and replaced by man. Prometheus delivered the news of destiny to the Olympian gods. This is what's going to happen. There isn't anything you can do about it. And so the Olympian gods are subject also to the tragic view of life. Whereas the Greek mystery religions went back to nature in its flow of time, stepping out of the temporality of the culture, going back to natural mystery time, so that the time of real changes in the process of nature now emerged one's ritual actions in such a way that they were likewise participating in nature and thus real, and that the experience that would come out of them would be realistic. And one would not be deceived by the society. One would not be deceptively involved in the culture. One would not be deluded and involved in the symbolic expansion of the culture into kingdoms and imperiums, into tyrannies. And one of the tragic things is that the mind will work in its abstract functioning very well in a deceived situation. Because as we started today, the mind cannot tell when there is some essential step missing in a sequence. That's why parlor magic, legerdemain, magicians can move their hands in such a way, in a subtle staccato movement that underplays a couple of movements, so that the perception coming into conception only sees the gestalt of the overflow and doesn't see the subtle, different movements that are subtracted from the gestalt, that are not apparent to the mind that they're there. And so the saying is, the hand is faster than the mind. Thought is faster than action, but the hand can be faster than the mind that is struggling in conception. Especially some kind of conception that is built on a deceived already experience. And so we're in a world today where almost every mind that you see is incapable of detecting flaw, incapable of participating in nature, has no feeling about the mystery of nature at all, does not understand that, for instance, a tree, a great tree, especially great pine trees, are like those great stupas. They're energy condensers. They bring in energy, just like the lightning rod, and just like the stupa of at Sanchi by Ashoka. Here it is all brought in and collected and distributed through the geometric forms of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water, in their geometric, symbolic stances, so that one has the energy from the ether through the four elements that then in the stupa resonate, and the relic of the Buddha in the stupa brings that resonance and sends it back out, because it is a part of the mystery of the Buddha not to be there ritually in any other form than a conveyor, instantly and perfectly. The Buddha's name for himself was not Buddha. The name for himself was Tathagata. Tathagata in Sanskrit, especially in the Magadhi dialect that the historical Buddha spoke, Tathagata means one gone. One's suchness is gone. And later on in the High Dharma, it used to be that one would refer to the Buddha as one well gone. It's like something well ordered. It's not just ordered, it is well ordered, which means that it is an integral that takes the entire natural cycle and puts it into a cycle where all the themes of renewable nature carry all the way through and are all renewed. And so one gets, in the sense, like a Taoist energy cycle. Tao, Te, Gen, E. And when you get to the 10,000 things, the 10,000 things flow back into Tao and are renewed instantly. So that nature always renews. But a social order plot has to maintain itself. It can't renew itself. And so instead of Isa as the shrine that's rebuilt every generation now for 1,300 years in Japan, it was rebuilt in 1953 when this book by Kenzo Tanga and Walter Gropius and all the great architects of the time made sure that everyone in the world who could get access to it, that this is what happens. You renew. Whereas the Katsura Palace needs to be maintained because this is a static place of authority and power. And once it became expanded out of the shogunate into imperial Japan, it wasn't just that Katsura was a palace, it's that anywhere that the Japanese imperial empire went had to be mulched into its order. And when they were in Nanjing, China in 1941, they killed 300,000 people to enforce upon them, you are now in the Japanese Empire. Let's take a little break. Let's come back. Let's come back to a ritual image. Here's the bridge, the Uji Bridge at Ise. It is a double bridge in the sense that there is a torii gate at the beginning and there's a torii gate at the end. And in between is the bridge. No one can ride a horse over this bridge. No one can drive a car over this bridge. The only way to cross that bridge is on foot. So that the approach to the ancient Ise shrine must be by your own locomotion, by your own walking. It is your walking that allows for this. And in ancient India, in Ashoka's time, when he built Sanchi, which is the prototype for this going back, Sanchi was 1,000 years before Ise. Ise is 1,000 years before Basho, and Basho is 400 years ago. The only way to approach Sanchi was largely by a long pilgrimage because it was placed in the very center of the deserts of India. At the very center, the geographic center of India, in the Deccan. And you have deserts which are flat for several hundred miles. And there, in the hot, hazy dust of the Deccan deserts of India, is Sanchi with the 4 giant gates. Not just like torii gates with the double, but they had triple on the 4 directions. The 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 ways, yes, no, maybe, possible. So that there was always this sense that when you came upon a shrine like Sanchi, you came from a vast, long, dry, sometimes perilous, but always strenuous. It required a lot of work to get there. And when one got there, you didn't get to a place so much as you got to an accumulated resonance that had a penetrative harmonic. It's like being able to be at a focus where one for the first time can hear the entire chord sounded. So that one no longer, once you have heard the harmonic chord sounded, you are no longer able to be deceived by some kind of illusory sequence of sounds. Some kind of just culturally arranged notes. You are now able to hear with the universal ear, which hears not just the notes, but hears the intervals between the notes at the same time. And so it's like a natural hearing is different from a cultural hearing. For a cultural hearing, you pay attention to the notes or to the words. In cultural rituals, they pay attention to just the ordered arrangement of steps to maintain. But in natural rituals, in natural hearing, in natural seeing, one sees the spaces. The process of time emerging those spaces becomes apparent to one, and later on in consciousness, there's a sense of timelessness, not because you cannot see time, you cannot sense time, but that you sense time with its context, which is eternal. Eternal. It's not even called timeless. That would be a misnomer. It's eternal. It's eternity. And just as space spontaneously blossoms out of time, time blossoms out of eternity. And so when Basho begins his narrow road to the deep north, he says days and months, time, are travelers of eternity. So are the years that pass by. So that time forms hours, days, months, seasons, years. Those time forms themselves occur as change, and eternity nourishes this. So that eternity is in no way static, but is like supercharged. So eternity is like a super time that allows for time to emerge in such a way that there is space, but that super time allows for something else to emerge that is hidden. As soon as time comes into play, it is given a kind of emotion, and that motion, time, when it blossoms into space, is given like clothing. And it's only much later, in a very rare transform of phases, that one comes to see that one can be aware of oneself in a kind of a special conscious way beneath the clothing of spatiality, beneath the pacing of time, and that you are in fact an eternal spirit, nude in your invisibility, in a cosmos without end. And this, of course, is the Zen quality. This is not only Zen, but it's there also in the highest registries of the Greek, classical Greek high dharma. There's a high dharma in classical Greek as well. And in classical Greek high dharma, its classic figure is Pythagoras. Just as the historical Buddha is there for India, our Lao Tzu is for China, in the Greek tradition, it was always Pythagoras. And that there was a Pythagorean ability to penetrate through the numbered sequences of ritual and all of the social authority orders of plots to discover by a harmonic disclosure the mystery of nature coursing through the transparency of the objective action comportment of existence, passing through one's mystery experience into a mind that was suddenly illuminated. The Greek term for that illumination, aletheia, meant not a truth or the truth, but meant truth. That it was not identifiable, but it was discoverable. And that the process of its discovery was that experience had to be natural. If experience was not natural, one was then not a continuousness. And the tone of the feeling of that natural continuity was one of effortless seamlessness. that in doing one's ritual steps, you were not doing steps, but you were unfolding like an accordion. The sequence, not of the steps so much, but the sequence of eternity, re-emergent and reoccurring picosecond by picosecond. And Pythagoras learned it in Egypt. He learned it in Heliopolis. He spent 22 years there studying. He was already a mature man when he went there, and he spent 22 years. And in the Heliopolitan recension, the way in which the Ogdoad, the 8 primordial 4 pairs of gods, are only real courtesy of a ninth. A ninth divinity which cannot be given a figure, is invisible. The earliest phrase that was used on it was nter, usually spelled with a couple of E's, netter. Or when given some kind of a figured character quality was called atun. Or later on, the pronunciation was Amun. Amun-Ra. And that Amun-Ra was the eternal divinity, the ninth, if you were able to count it, but it was like a ninth that was infinite in its eternity. And that the Ogdoad, the 4 pairs, the Ogdoad, the octave, the set of the 12 notes that one can hear together, occur as a cyclic theme that has its phases out of it, emerged out of it. And this is something that is a theme in Greek tragedy, almost to a painful nth degree in Euripides' Bacchae. What obviates the ability in classical Greek culture to understand this at all? And it was so often understood that there is a mystery here, and we're not going to be buffaloed by the culture. We're not going to be deceived by this. And so when you look at the classical Greek culture, there was a journey by foot, largely out of Athens, along the coast, to a place called Eleusis, where the Eleusinian mysteries were practiced. And in antiquity, one of the few observations that was observed universally was that one does not talk about the mysteries. You do not talk about what happens there. It is not available for a discursive language. It's not available for a mythos in experience. It's not a sequence that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is an eternal field out of which the emergence is a mystery. And so men and women all over classical times would go to places like Eleusis to participate in the mysteries. Not just Eleusis, one of the most mysterious places at that time was Delphi. And Delphi not only had an oracle, but Delphi was a very nature mystery place, because at Delphi, where Mount Parnassus, which is quite a formidable granite monolith, meets the bay, at the end of which is Corinth, where they meet, there's a geologic pressure and there's a deep fracture. And in that lower ravine of the canyon, below Parnassus, where Delphi was, is a fracture that goes down quite a ways into the earth. It's like not a cave, but a fracture into the earth's crust, quite far, so that from time to time, very mysterious vapors would come up from the unplumbed, unknowable depths of the earth. And so the shrine of the Oracle of Delphi was built over that fracture in the earth. And the tripod seat of the oracle was placed right over the fracture, and to make sure that there was no cultural impurity, the Oracle of Delphi was always a young girl. Usually just fresh into adolescence, not yet experienced enough in adolescence to consider herself a woman. No longer a girl, not yet a woman, right in between, so that her purity of openness to a complete transform of her physicality, of her body, was the seal of the holiness of the guarantee that she would speak with a language of eternal divinity, and not with her own words, not with the culture's language, not with the syntax of anything that anyone knew. And so what she said, what she spoke, was always not an unconscious, not a subconscious, but a mystery utterance, which when it was heard in terms of a culture was always a riddle. Was always a riddle in the sense that it wasn't what the words said discursively that were its meaning. And it wasn't subtle hints, literary or otherwise, metaphorical or otherwise. It was nothing in the mythic quality of oral language, but it was always deeper. It was a language of ritual comportment emerging out of the mysteriousness of unplumbed eternal nature. And one finds, when you come to someone like an Aristotle, that there is no respect whatsoever in him for the mysteries. There is no respect whatsoever for the mystery religions. There is even scant respect for some of the more delicate qualities of wisdom. And so when you come into the Poetics, when he talks about character, he talks about it this way. The translation in the Penguin Classics of Aristotle done by Malcolm Heath, done not too long ago, 1996. Here's how Aristotle talks about Greek tragedy. Enough has been said about the structure of events and what plots should be like. As for character, there are 4 things to aim at. 1, first and foremost, goodness. As was said earlier, speech or action will possess character if it discloses the nature of a deliberate choice. The character is good if the choice is good. This is possible in each class of person. There is such a thing as a good woman and a good slave, even though one of these is perhaps deficient and the other, generally speaking, inferior. Women are deficient, slaves inferior. In Aristotle, of course. It's the way the culture, authority runs. 2, secondly, appropriateness. Goodness, no. Goodness in an Aristotelian way. Choice. Decision. Secondly, appropriateness. It is possible for the character to be courageous, but for this to be an inappropriate way for a woman to display courage or cleverness. But for this to be an inappropriate way for a woman to display courage or cleverness. It isn't just sexist. It isn't just a gender bias. This is something deeper. This is an inculcation of authority by traditional order back onto actions, such that it weeds out any way that ritual comportment can come out of nature. Because women can be very natural, as men are, even more so. So this has to be weeded out. It has to be filtered out. It isn't about sexism. It isn't about gender. It's the roots of tyranny. Third, likeness. This is not the same as of making good character good and appropriate, as has already been stated. Likeness. He means here representation. One has to pay attention to the representations. If the representations are correctly identified in terms of the ethos, the mythos, the social order, then that's what they are. It isn't about presentation, it's about representation. So when we talked last week a little bit about Aristotle, he said the quality of Greek tragedy is it's a representational action. That's what it means. You don't look to the action, you look to what it represents. You look to its semblance. So the Greek word for this was mimesis. That the structure in the rituals where we get our meaning and you need to learn to get your meaning is in the mimetic representation in its ordered structure. And its ordered structure is there because we have put it there. It's for us to tell you and for you to pay attention. It's about obedience. Fourth, consistency. Even if the subject of the imitation is inconsistent, and that is the kind of character that is presupposed, it should nevertheless be consistently inconsistent. Mimesis, imitation, imitatio. One finds one of the classics in the Renaissance by Thomas à Kempis, Imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. It's not about Jesus. It's about the figure of the imitation of Christ that you should inculcate so that your character is obedient to that, and then your individuality will be approved. This is a very deep, serious, severe flaw. And the vapors that come up from this flaw have choked off Western civilization completely. So it's not viable any longer. But it's not just Western civilization. All the civilizations on the planet were choked off by this same flaw in their own ways. And in Basho, when you find 1,000 years after the establishment of Isa, in between Basho and Isa and that 1,000 years, his most favorite poet was named Saigyo. Lived in the 1100s. We mentioned him this morning a little bit. Here's a little book called Saigyo, the Poet of Reflective Being and Natural Scene. Saigyo, when he was 23, he'd been privy to this great transformation from the Fujiwara clan authority to the new shogunate authority, and was absolutely repulsed. While you could find a way to be subtle and get along with clan authority in Heian Japan, like all the women, like Lady Murasaki and Shei Shonagon, all the great women authors of Heian Japan learned to deal with it and became quite lovely in their subtlety and humanity. But when the shogunate came in, all of that was changed, cut off. It is no longer possible to find your humanity in between the cracks because the cracks have all been filled in. It's no longer a court ritual that is lots of pieces of rock put together with little bits of moss in between so that you can eke out a life. But now the whole thing is paved with concrete all the way solid. There's no moss if we don't want there to be moss. And you will not do one single action unless it's approved. And so Saigyo at 23 opted out, took Buddhist vows, went out into the country, went out into nature to not only just breathe deeply, but learn how to breathe again. And here's a couple of his poems. These are translated in 1991 by Burton Watson, the Columbia University. Has a whole series of Asian classics they've been publishing for 40 years. One of the great translators, Burton Watson. 2 poems about autumn. And when Saigyo wrote poems, he wrote waka. And waka were 31-syllable poems. The first 3 sections, the first 3 steps of a waka were 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. And then the 4th and 5th steps were 7 syllables, 7 syllables. 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. So that you got a syncopation, an alteration, and the 5th was a repeat of the 4th because that allowed then the 5th to be followed by another 5, which was the beginning of a new waka. It's like in the octave, the 8 notes, 7 notes are in the scale, and the 8th note is the first note in the next. So that an octave has in its 8th place not the conclusion of it, but the next step up, 1 degree up, 1 notch up, so that one could have the beginning then of the next octave. It meant that octaves are not existential separately, but they are existential in a linked manner with the next octave. So that the octaves, in a natural way, flow in their continuity from one to the next, to the other, and so forth. And so in Saigyo, his waka were 5, 7, 5, 7, 7, allowing then for the next waka to be there, and that it was possible to have the next waka linked with the previous one. And when they were linked, they called them not waka, but now the form was that the links could be of any length, and they're called renga, linked verse. And the links were put into very special lengths. The first length of the renga that was formed classically was 36. 36 waka in a renga, linked verse sequence, richly produced then a multi-faceted ritual view of something from 36 different angles. Later on, when a great artist like Hokusai would do his first great illustrated book. Hokusai, born in the 1700s, lived into the 1800s. His first book was 36 Views of Mount Fuji. The classic Japanese ritual renga style of these 36 views. But the preferred sequence was not just 36, but was 100. So you have something like Hiroshige doing 100 views of Edo, 100 waka linked in Renga style to produce this really massive, because Edo, which became Tokyo, is a big place. Mount Fuji is big, but it's just one place that you see from all different places. But a city the size of Edo already was like, really, there's a lot of different places. And when Basho moved to Edo, from his stint in Ueno, in between Nara and Ise, had a little sojourn being a tutor for a young court royal who suddenly died very young in an accident, and Basho was left to try and earn his living in whatever way he could, and eventually began publishing poems. And instead of publishing Renga or waka, he started to publish just the beginnings of the waka, the 5-7-5, and he called them in his time hoku. Later on, at the end of the 19th century, a great poet using that form called them haiku. His name was Shiki. And it's because of Shiki calling them haiku that we call them haiku now. They were originally called hoku. In fact, when you come to traditional Japanese poets who know very well the tradition and who were old enough to know that they were always called hoku, here this book is called Japanese Hokus, not Japanese Haikus. Published in Boston, the Four Seas Company, published in 1920. And the author is Yone Noguchi, who was the father of Isamu Noguchi, married an American woman. So his son Isamu was half Japanese, half American. Became one of the world's greatest sculptors. Here's what his father wrote and published in 1920. The reason why in Boston is because Boston was the center of the appreciation of the Orient in the United States at that time. Because the appreciation of the Orient was largely because of sea lanes, and the shipping lanes mostly came to Boston at that time. And so you had people in Boston who were very affine to collecting Oriental things, and so the Boston museums of fine art have great collections of Oriental things. And they publish things like this, Japanese Hoku, and he says in the epilogue, our thoughts and emotions are only the continuation of the thoughts and emotions of our ancestors, which were often left hidden, unexpressed, happily for us, but always in existence, like the touch of air. While our thoughts may appear so sudden, frighteningly new, they have somewhere a link, surely, to the stars. And so you can see from what I'm saying, what he's saying. And he says, it is natural course to enter the invisible from the visible, as you step from night into day. But you must let it come after having enough satisfaction of the outward things. The mellow perfection of the night only comes after the splendor of the sun. As for me, I have no strong love with the outward things, and always take a deep delight in a little inward world, the largest world, perhaps, of my creation, and rarely sing the visible beauty. Is it because I am philosophical? Perhaps I am, without knowing it at all. Is it because I am somewhat logical? Perhaps I am, although people, I included, do not notice it. One thing I can say with much faith is that I take a great energy to gain an assertion and a tireless persistence to be content with the invisible things. Yet must fully understand the beauty of life if you want to see the beauty of death. And Life will be more beautiful from the reason of contrast with death, and death again from the contrast with life. Will be more tender in pathos, more subtle in rhythm. My song is always with the falling leaves and the dying day. And so you find in the vocabulary of haiku some terms that are extraordinary, and I'll just give you a few of them, and then next week we'll go deeper into it again, deeper resonance. One of the terms is sabi, and sabi has a quality of what has been called lonely beauty. Not the beauty of loneliness, but lonely beauty. It's a poignant missingness that the floating world consistently always has, if one could only appreciate it. Another is wabi, instead of sabi, wabi. Wabi is loving the free life beyond the social wealth and position skein of experience is a whole different free experience that comes because one is living as a continuation of nature. The word wabi comes from two different words. One of them means to languish, and the other one means lonely. And you would think together to languish in a lone fashion, but it isn't languish so much as it is to drift in a participation with the natural real, even though one has to be all alone. Except the fact that usually what happens here is that someone who has this appreciative quality meeting someone else who has these appreciative qualities form very natural pairs, but not pairs like two, but pairs like a tuning fork. So one of the most salient qualities of character that comes from this figuration, that comes from nature's mystery, is that they happen to become not just best friends, but they become eternal companions. They've always been together. And so the haiku was 5-7-5, and the companion to oneself would write the 7-7. So that instead of just having a waka or a renga, now you had an atomic verse form called the tanka, and the tanka was a haiku by someone and the end of it by their companion. And so when Basho goes on the narrow road to the deep north, his companion is Sora, and the two of them went together. And they were always together. They are eternally together, like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. Basho and Sora are forever together because they are together as a tuning fork of the real in eternity. Theirs is not a literature of some culture. That shogunate culture has been gone for 150 years. Basho and Sora are more themselves than ever. In early 1960s, Japan Airlines, in order to promote Japanese qualities in the West, made a haiku contest. And I received over 50,000 entries. And one of the men who, an older American, who wrote the pamphlet of the Japan Society in New York, how to write these haiku, was Harold G. Henderson, Haiku in English. This is the pamphlet form, 1965. He was 76 years old at the time. It's interesting because the haiku form has appealed since that time, since the early 60s, increasingly to children all over the world. School children all over the world love writing haiku because they participate as resonances of the eternal Basho and Sora, who are always traveling in eternity together. More next week.